Hi, so Tim Robinson here with some thoughts about your action research assignment. Just to make it clear, I'm not talking here about the formalities of actually submitting the finished piece of work, and we're not going to talk in any detail at all about the learning outcomes. That's all for another day. But I thought it might be useful now to give just a kind of overview of the kind of content that you might be looking to generate for your final essay on the action research project, and some suggestions for a structure that you might want to fit this into. I know this sounds like I'm kind of jumping the gun, but I think it's helpful as you're producing this stuff and as it's all kicking around in your head. It can be interesting to see how it's actually going to map out into your final essay. For more detail on this, have a look in McNiff and Whitehead, our set book. Chapter 6 has a nice, useful approach to writing up your final essay. Okay, worth saying that in terms of structure particularly, these are just suggestions, okay? They're not set in stone. You can merge the sections together, you can split them apart, you can adapt them to suit your purposes. Some projects will be different from others, they're not all going to be one size. And for example, some projects will be quite heavy on reading, on educational theory, in which case if you've got lots of that stuff you might need to deal with it in a specific way and have its own section. You might want a whole literature review just to talk about the ideas that you found in your reading. Some projects will have a lot less reading or hardly any, and you can slip that in alongside other stuff. So just be aware that this stuff is flexible. It doesn't need to be, it's not one size fits all. You can adapt this to suit yourself. The one thing I would say though is that all projects you need to be aware of the idea of a timeline running through your project. So I suggest the neatest way to think about this is to think you need a set of bookends, basically. So at the beginning of your project, you need a chunk that's going to set up the subject, put it in context, explain what it is that you're planning on doing and how you're going to do that. And at the end of the project, when you've finished, you're going to have a section where you reflect back on the project, how did it go, and looking forward into the future, what are you going to take away from the project? Okay, so you can separate those two bits out, and in the middle you can tell the story of your action research cycles, and I think you can do that in sort of chronological order, and I think you need to do that in chronological order. Otherwise you just tie yourself in knots trying to decide what belongs where. It's very confusing to write, and it's also very confusing to read. So I think that sense of sort of chronology is really worth bearing in mind. Okay, so our first big chunk at the front end of the project, which is going to sort of set up the whole thing, is you writing some kind of, you can call it part one, you can call it an introduction, but either way you're putting this whole thing in context. What's your background? So what are you bringing to the table? What situation are you in? What work are you currently doing? What's the context for the project? What is the issue that it is you want to change? What do you want to try and improve through the process of doing the project? And why does this matter to you? So here you can sort of refer back to your professional values statement from PG01. So just to kind of introduce the topic, say what it is and why it matters. And the second part of your introduction, or it could be a separate section, whatever, I suggest would be a good place to talk about research itself. So you could call this research, or you could call it methodology, you could call it just the back end of your introduction, whatever, it doesn't matter. But I think it's a good place to talk about the fact that this is going to be an action research project, and you can explain what actually is action research. Yes, you've done some reading, you know how it works, you know what it's for, and you can see that it could be appropriate for the kind of changes you want to bring about. You can also explain, as we know, that action research isn't just about taking action, it's about doing research on that action. So you can talk here about what kinds of evidence are you going to be trying to produce, what methods are you using, how are you using them, and you could maybe have some references here to some of the set books on using different kinds of research. So are you doing, making videos of yourself and then analysing them? Are you handing out questionnaires to the students? Are you doing interviews with other tutors? What kind of methods are you using to try and find evidence for what's going on? So I suggest with those two sections, so introducing yourself and the project and the issue you want to change, and talking about the kind of ways that you're going to do that via action research in general and via these particular research methods, you can get all that kind of messy introductory stuff out the way first, and then that makes room for you to say, okay, talk about your action research cycles. Okay. So at this point, we can start talking about your first cycle. As we know, they have 4 steps. Step 1 being evaluate your start point. So here, I think we could have some detail here, some specifics, some evidence, some examples of what this issue is that you want to change. So what's the whole project about? What is the thing that you want to change? So what does it look like in your own teaching or in the room, the way the students behave, the way they interact, or is it in the final assessments? Where are you looking for signs? Where are you looking for the evidence for what this thing is? A nice way to think of this, you've seen this on slides already, is the idea of I, you and them. So my own impressions of what I think this situation is. The you could be other people involved in the project, so students or colleagues. What do they, how do they behave? How do they talk about or discuss this item? And then the them could be writers and theorists or researchers, educational theory written in books and stuff that you can't actually get to talk to the people, but you can get their ideas. So we can kind of bounce those 3 different sources of evidence around. And if you can include all those, it'll be very convincing as a way of evaluating your starting position. Step 2 of your cycle is going to be making a plan. So if you know the thing that you want to change, you know what it looks like, what are your options for changing this thing? So where did you actually look for advice? So here you could be talking about reading that you've done on the subject. So this could actually be like a bit of a literature review where you've looked and read, to try and find ideas. Have you been talking to colleagues? Are you doing interviews with them? Are you doing lesson observations of their lessons? Are they coming in to see what you're doing and talk about that? Are you making a plan based just on kind of your own hunches? This is how it was for you when you were learning, so you think it'll work for other people, whatever. So you're basically drawing together all these different ideas from all these different places, potentially, and explaining and justifying the choices that you're making. Here's what I'm intending to do, and this is why I think it will work. Step 3, as we know, is the action bit. That's the fun part. What did you actually do? So here's what you tried in the room. Every week for 6 weeks, I did this, this, and this, or I stopped doing that and instead blah, 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 or I got the students to whatever it may be. So what happened when you tried this new intervention, this new approach that you're trying? Did it go well? Didn't it go well? Did some bits work really great? Some bits not happen at all? And what evidence do you have for this? So are we talking, photos of the whiteboard? Are we talking videos of lessons? Are we talking lesson observations? Is it entries in your research journal of you reflecting back over what's happened week by week? Where's your evidence for what's happening? And then at the end of cycle 1, you're reflecting back. Why do you think it happened the way it did? What's your takeaway? What have you learned from the process of trying out your intervention? What would you keep? What would you throw away? What would you change? Whatever. Okay, so this is you looking back over cycle 1, and as you enter cycle 2, it's worth saying cycle 2 could probably, your description of it could probably be a bit briefer because you've already done lots of the donkey work setting up, the topic and your approach. But you still need to say, as you start cycle 2, you need to evaluate the position that you're in. Are you going to do more of the same? Are you going to change your approach? Are you going to try new things? Do you need new ideas? If so, where are you going to find them? Are you going to do more reading? Are you going to do more observations? Are you going to talk to colleagues again? Where is this new input going to come from? And then you're going to act in cycle 2. Again, what seems to work, what doesn't work, what's your evidence for this? And again, at the end of cycle 2, you're looking back and reflecting on what happened. So I think cycle 1 and cycle 2 can be, trying to work through in chronological order. You can do it, almost sort of working through a calendar saying this is what happened on this week, that's what happened on that week. You can be quite sort of detailed and factual, if you like, as you work your way through that timeline. So then out the back of your second cycle, we need some kind of section. Again, title is optional. You could call it your conclusions, you could call it your project findings, you could call it discussion, something like that, where you look back over the project and talk about how it went. So this is not just trying to dress this up as being, oh wow, it's great and now I know everything I need to know. It's very much more, we need some critical awareness of how this project actually ran. So you need to be able to discuss how well you have actually done this action research project. So can you show what kind of evidence you have, and how convincing do you think that evidence actually is? Like, how well have you actually done this thing? And if you're drawing conclusions from your evidence, are your conclusions reasonable? Do you think anybody else looking at this evidence that you've got would come to the same conclusions as you? Is this debatable? Again, if you can think of those three different sources of advice, so my own feelings about this, what the students or what other teachers, your colleagues might say, and maybe you can bounce some of this stuff back to ideas that you found in your reading. Is it like, oh yeah, actually, you know, that theorist that I read, he said this as well, or, you know, she came up with that idea and I found that to be true. So if you can bounce it back to the kind of your starting point or ideas that you found elsewhere, so much the better. I think the key term here, and you'll be hearing this a lot, is the idea of transparency. So it's like you get the brownie points for being open and honest about your discussion, for being critically aware of what you've done well and maybe what you haven't done so well. And that discussion is the important bit, rather than trying to dress it up to make it all look, you know, perfect or ideal, or now you've fixed it. I mean, maybe you have, that would be nice, but it's your critical discussion around those issues, which is kind of where the marks are, if you like, and where the value is for you, I think, too. Okay, and then the final section, and this could be just part of a bigger conclusion, or it could be a separate section, is some kind of critical evaluation of your own personal and professional development. So rather than looking back over the project, this is rather you looking forward into the future. What are you going to take away as you move forward in your career? So how have you developed personally and professionally through doing the project, and what do you think the implications are for improving your work in the future? It's worth saying the assessment scheme suggests that this could be like 1,000 words, which is a pretty big chunk out of a 6,000 word project. So that gives you some idea of how important this section is. Okay, so if that's a kind of theoretical version of a possible structure for your action research essay, I thought it might be helpful just to see one example of a contents page, which is from my action research project that I finished sort of 12 months ago. And I think contents pages are underrated. I think they're very useful, and it's tempting to leave it until you finish the project and then think about the contents page to reflect what you've already done. But I think you can use it very effectively as an essay plan. If you actually map out what you want to say, it's almost like you're providing yourself with a template that you can then, you know, fill in the parts as required. Okay, so here's my contents page, and I just thought it'd be helpful just to talk through it very briefly. So my introduction was actually very short. I think it was only a page, just saying I started work at BIM in 2013. I took over the research module. All the second year students have to do this module, but I'd never taught it before. It was really scary. The second part was some specifics about the module itself, like me discussing what the issue that I wanted to focus on was, which was mainly just that the quality of the work that was produced was pretty awful, I thought. And in particular, the way that students were using research methods was just dismal. Was all kind of casual and informal, and they wouldn't read any research theory to actually use their methods effectively. It was rubbish. And also about my lectures themselves, which I thought were pretty terrible as well. In fact, because I'd never worked in higher education before, so my lectures were all transmission, just me standing at the front, blah blah blah. It was the whole thing. It's just horrible. Basically, the whole thing was horrible. So the next bit of that was the PG Cert itself. So thank goodness, here comes some training that I might actually be able to figure out how to get better at doing this, because I wanted to get better at doing it and I didn't really know what to do. So here I am starting the PG Cert. Great, maybe this will help. So the next section was, I called it methodology, which is basically all the stuff to do with research. So this project is going to be an action research project, as I was describing earlier on in the other previous slides. So this is me saying, okay, this looks great because it works like this, it's intended for that, you must always make sure, blah, 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 this is what action research is, and it looks like it's going to be great. And here are the ways that I plan on producing evidence for change for this issue that I want to shift. So I talked a little bit about doing interviews or doing observations or, whatever. And then I hit the sort of chronological part, if you like. I actually did 3 cycles rather than 2, and I used a cycle per term. So 3 terms of the academic year, each one got a cycle to itself, which kind of worked quite nicely. And I talked in detail about cycle 1. Here are the things that were happening in the room. Here's how it seemed to work. Cycle 2, in fact, was a bit of a train wreck because I didn't really think about it properly and just assumed it would work the same as cycle 1, and it didn't. But then cycle 3, I thought a bit more about it, and the content was different, and that actually worked quite nicely, blah, blah, blah. So I taught my way through those 3 terms with a bit of detail about the specifics of what was happening. Not too much reflection, really. It was more just a kind of trying to be a factual account of what happened. And then the back end of my assignment, I think actually this was quite a good choice looking back. I tried different ways of discussing the project and what I'd found, and I ended up deciding the neatest way to talk about this, and this is optional, you don't have to do this, but this worked quite well for me, was to talk about the different kinds of evidence that I had. So like talking about the project as a whole seemed like too big and too vague. So instead I worked my way through the different bits of evidence that I had. So the first thing was classroom activities. So I had photos of whiteboard and flip chart paper and my own sort of memories and descriptions of the things that were happening in the room. Here all the students are all being active, whereas before they were passive. I'm getting them to generate knowledge rather than try and receive it from me, blah, blah, blah. The next bit was my research diary. So I had some particular entries, week by week, showing my own kind of reflection on what had happened that week. Yeah, that went really well. Ooh, that didn't go very well at all. I need to do more of this. Why the hell did I do that? Blah, blah, blah. 5.3 marking the project. So that was the big one for me, because I'd said earlier on that the real marker, as far as I was concerned, was the quality of the work that comes out in the final written assessments for the module. So in a way, I was saying that the formative assessments for them is kind of, sorry, the summative assessments for them, like the final written piece of work that they get marked on, that's acting as like formative assessment for me. So that's where I get to see the effect of the changes that I'd tried to put into place. So that was the sort of big one for me. I also had some external evidence because the moderator on the module actually remarked on how much better the work was. So that was like, ooh, great, I've actually got some support from elsewhere. It isn't just me making it up. I also did some lesson videos, which were not what I thought they were going to be. Actually, when I watched them again, they were quite uncomfortable to watch, and that sort of brought me down to earth a little bit, because I thought it was going to show, oh, look how engaged and active the students are, and actually, guess what? It was me just going blah, 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 far more than I thought. So that was quite sobering and actually very useful to have. The student interviews, so I did a whole bunch of interviews with students towards the end of the module. That was great. They were really fun and really interesting and really useful. That's one thing that I've kept on doing every year, in fact, because it was so interesting. So lots of good stuff from there. I also included the module evaluation questionnaire, which was not much use, and comments from the Board of Studies, which again was so vague as to be not really worth having, but I thought I'd chuck them in anyway. And then I tried to wrap all of this up by saying, okay, I've got all these different kinds of evidence. They're all saying slightly different things, pointing in slightly different directions, but I think overall we can say that, we can sum up the project and say blah, blah, blah. And then I did, in fact, lift out the section on personal and professional development and talk about that as a separate section, talking about what I'd drawn from the project, what I'd learned about myself and about my teaching, and what I was going to be, taking away as I move forward in my lovely teaching career. Okay, I also got quite a good mark, just as well. Anyway, so I hope that little glimpse of structure and content will be helpful. As I say, it's flexible, not set in stone, but it might give you some food for thought in terms of the kind of content that you need, but also how you might actually approach presenting this stuff when the time comes. So any issues, send me an email, book a tutorial, whatever, and I hope it helps. Cheers.